Oh dear, someone's recording it. I better make this really good then. Well, it's lovely to see you all this morning. I do look forward to the day when we can all meet face to face. Although meeting up face to face after so long of being apart can maybe pose some significant problems. Maybe you've had the same issues as me. I was at an event the other day and there was lots of people there that I had met online. I'd spoken to them online for months and months and months, but when we actually met face to face, I just didn't recognize any of them. They all looked so different from their Zoom pictures and their photos. Maybe you're the same. I think the reason was because they were big. They weren't just these tiny little people on the screen of kind of Lego man sized. But incidentally, one of my friends made me out of Lego. So if you see me, I'll bring me along next time so you can see that there is. There you are. Do you think that looks like me? Not so sure. Anyway, over the last few months, you have been working through the letter to the Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans. And I'm sure you've realized by now that this at times is a pretty heavy going letter. It's the kind of letter that you read after a good night's sleep, a full English breakfast, and then a clear head. And our passage, which Chloe so wonderfully read for us this morning, is no exception. It's full of interesting, complicated and difficult things. So I hope you have all had a good breakfast because we're about to start. So to sum up, this passage really covers three things: law, faith, hope. Law, faith, hope. Now, as a preacher, I spent ages trying to get the thesaurus out to come up with a fancy acronym so you could remember the points. I was looking at different words to try and make them all start with the same letter, but I couldn't come up with anything. So I'm just going to call it LFH, LFH, law, faith, and hope. And I'm sure you'll remember that, LFH, LFH. So the first one is law. Verse 15 says, the law brings wrath. The law brings wrath. When I was a little boy, I used to like watching a movie called Judge Dredd. I don't know if anyone here has seen it. It stars the king of action, Sylvester Stallone. So I'm sure already you can tell that this is not an Oscar-winning movie. But Stallone plays a futuristic criminal judge, and he drives around on this motorbike, dishing out justice to anyone that commits crimes. And there's this wonderful scene in it when Stallone looks deep into the camera with his eyes and he shouts, "I am the law." I don't know if you've seen that kind of classic moment. I am the law. So what is the law? What makes the law? Who dishes out justice for the law? For Jews, the law is absolutely everything. It tells them how to structure their lives, how to engage with each other, and how to respond to God. If you want to please God and get into heaven, you simply need to follow the rules. And there are 613 laws. That's a lot of laws to follow, 613 laws that span over the course of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And these were the laws, it's called the Mosaic Law. They were laws given to Moses. So to be a good Jew meant keeping all these laws, 613. But the issue of the law wasn't one that was resolved easily, because Jesus in his life continually came up against the Pharisees and the religious teachers over how you should follow the law. These religious leaders thought that being a bad Jew, that Jesus was being a bad Jew because he was doing things that the law prohibited, such as healing and doing different things on a Sunday. So when Jesus was doing these things, they went apoplectic because in their minds, Jesus wasn't following the rules. So therefore, Jesus wasn't a good Jew at all. I mean, the religious leaders may as well have been on their motorcycle looking at folk and saying, "I am the law." They were the ones that interpreted the law. So you can maybe begin to see how revolutionary this Christian message was that a heart turned towards Jesus was far more important than a heart enslaved by the law. The Jewish leaders at the time that Paul was writing this letter, they held Abraham up as the finest example of a man who followed all the rules. They said that Abraham, because he followed all the rules, he was justified by his faithful works, his faithful obedience to God, and as such, he was the rightful father of all law-abiding Jews. But Paul's quite clever in what he does, because as he's writing here, he basically says, yes, Abraham believed, yes, Abraham was faithful, yes, he was devoted to God, but Abraham was around 400 years before Moses actually wrote down the law and gave it to the people. So Paul is asking, how can you be the best lawkeeper in the universe when the law hasn't been written yet? That's like me saying that Queen Victoria is the fastest texter in the world, even though phones hadn't been invented back in her day. It's just something that is just a bit bizarre. How can you be the best at something when it hasn't yet been invented? And so Paul says that then makes Abraham the father of Jews and Gentiles, of everybody. We're all Abraham's children because we all follow God together. So why is that important, you might ask? Well, Paul was trying to convince the Jews that both the Jewish and the Gentile Christians were not these separate things that should never come together. He was saying that whether you're a Jewish Christian or a Gentile Christian doesn't matter, because we're all connected through Abraham, through the one family of God. And what that means for us is that we're all part of that same family of Abraham, as well, as that little wonderful video just demonstrated to us that we saw about Abraham. We're all part of the divine plan that God has that stretches through time and history. That each church isn't to be this little unit that functions on its own. Each Christian is not to be a little unit that functions on their own. We're all connected in our past, in our history, in our story, in our future. Yes, we all do it differently, but that's part of the joy of creativity, not the formulaic law that we follow. So what about faith? Verse 13 says, "It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be the heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith." So Paul said that Abraham couldn't have been a man of the law because the law hadn't been written in his day, but he was definitely a man of faith. So what's faith? Well, the most perhaps famous definition in the Bible of faith is Hebrews 11, verse 1. It says, "Faith is the assurance of the things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." My first job was as a paper boy. Don't know if anyone did that in your time. I took over my brother's paper round when he retired at the old age of 16. And I can remember when the first paycheck came in and I counted up the cash. I can't remember exactly how much I got, but I do remember thinking, is that it? I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I've cycled for hours in the rain. I've put all this effort in and I've earned £3.50 and a flat tire. It's just not that good. If you work for something in our world, if you work for something, there's an obligation from both sides. You are obliged to put the work in and your boss is obliged to pay you. That's just the way it works. If I want to get paid, I am obliged to work. And if I work, the Air Force is obliged to pay me. It's a transaction. Paul, I don't think, had a paper round. Maybe he did. But he contrasts works and faith. He says works involve an obligation from both sides, but faith is a free choice, a humble acceptance, and there's no expectation. Faith is about free giving and free choice. Sometimes I think it would just be easier if God just gave us a big checklist and we just went through life and ticked it off. And then at the end of the day, we looked through and thought, oh, 51% checked off, that's me sorted. But that's not the way that God works, because there's no willingness in that. There's no humility in simply checking each thing as you go through. In essence, works, because of that obligation, are human attempts to make claims and demands upon God. If I follow this rule, then you owe me, you are obliged to give me something. So you can already begin to see that this doesn't quite sit with Christianity, because God is by definition a God of grace. He has chosen freely to love us and freely to bless us. If God is only concerned with our works and following the laws, then he doesn't care about our hearts or our free response to him. God then becomes some kind of all-powerful robot who lacks a heart, lacks compassion, and lacks a genuine interest in the motivations of his creation. God cares about the motivations of the heart. He cares about the longings of the soul. He cares about the pain in our spirit. He cares about all of this because he is a God of true love, a God of compassion, and a God of grace. And he wants us to spend more time looking at him and less time slavishly and unthinkingly simply following a set of rules. And that's difficult, and it's hard to do, because it's easier for us to look at a checklist than to look into the face of Jesus. Because if we're looking at a checklist, then we're a bit protected. When we look at the face of Jesus, we can't simply continue the way that we are. When we look into the face of Jesus, we're compelled to change our lives. We're brought to our knees in worship. Our lives are dramatically, radically changed. You cannot look at a book and be changed. No, sorry, you can look at a book and not be changed, but you cannot look at the face of the Lord and remain as you are. I think that's wonderful. You cannot look at the face of the Lord and remain as you are. So what about hope? Verse 18 says, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations. When you think about it, Abraham was quite a guy. He was old, he was well past it. He had no kids with his wife, Sarah. He was looking towards the end of his life. But he never gave up that little bit of hope that somehow God would work through the situation. My favorite verse in this is verse 19. Let me just read it to you. I think Paul was trying to be funny when he wrote this. Paul's not known for his humor, but I think this is really funny. Listen to this, verse 19. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old. I'm sure maybe you felt like that some mornings when the alarm goes off and you feel a bit like Abraham. Maybe the grandchildren have stayed over and you're exhausted. Maybe you had a lot on at work and you can't find the strength to get out of bed. Or maybe on a more serious note, maybe you've got a lot of emotional stuff going on in your life at the moment and life just seems a bit too hard. Maybe your mind is a bit too distracted. Maybe you're just struggling to focus. We all have those Abraham moments when we feel useless, powerless, as if God is determined to make things more difficult. But the point about Abraham's faith was that it faced reality. It was not a faith of denial, of wishing things were different and of baseless hope. The verse says, without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead. He faced the fact, he faced reality, he faced the difficulty. For many of us, this might not seem like a particularly good bit of advice because facing some of the things in our own lives can be difficult, traumatic, and painful. But when Abraham faced these problems and these difficulties, He didn't focus purely on these problems and allow his eyes to be transfixed by these problems. He raised his eyes above the thing in front of him to see what lay beyond. And it was God, and it was God's promises. When all human hope failed, Abraham put his faith in God. And that's what it says in verse 20. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. How wonderful is that, being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he promised. Abraham knew that if he got lost in the problems before him, then he would be lost in life. But he knew that if he raised his eyes to the face of the Lord, then he would be lost in wonder. And perhaps that's the best thing to take from the passage today. That Abraham wasn't perfect, just as we are not perfect. Abraham had doubts, just as we have doubts. But his heart was consistently one of faith and hope that God would always keep his promises. And so the law points to faith, faith points to hope, hope points to God. We're not to be caught in slavish obedience to the law, but free to respond to God with our hearts, our minds, our souls, our strength. We are to be people of faith who focus not on a book of the law, but on the face of the Lord. And we are to be a people of hope who do not get lost in the problems before us, but who get lost in the love of the Lord. The law points to faith. Faith points to hope. Hope points to God. Amen.